Welcome to this very special edition of the Armstrong Williams Show with the Prime Minister-elect of Israel, the Honorable Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the first Prime Minister to be born in Israel after its declaration of independence, and he's the longest-serving Prime Minister in the history of Israeli elections. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your new book, My Story.
Well, thank you, Armstrong. It's good to be with you again and with your audience.
Mr. Prime Minister, talk about the process of writing this book. Was it a catharsis for you? You talked about writing about this book during budget meetings. Was it so important that you had to write this book because this story needed to be told?
The answer is yes, but despite that answer, I couldn't write it while I was in office. I'm grateful for the outgoing government, which we've brought down after a fitful year, for giving me the time to write the book. Now, it's true, I wrote it in budget meetings as leader of the opposition. I wrote it in the swirling roads of the Negev and the Galilee as I was going to campaign stops. I wrote it longhand, and I wrote it because it poured out from my heart and soul. I guess it's a story I wanted to tell. And I'm very glad that readers in Israel and the United States and many parts of the world are finding it of interest. They read it, they tell me that they pick it up, and they don't put it down until it's over. Given that it's not exactly a tiny book, that's a big compliment.
Well, the Economist refers to it sort of as a juggernaut. You know, you revered your father, Benzion, as I did my father, James, and you talked about the move to the United States, but you enjoy Jonathan return to Israel. Why did you part?
Well, we left Israel for a few years as children, and then as teenagers because of my father's research, historical research, which he did in the United States. But we were born in Israel, we were raised in Israel, we went back to serve in the Army of Israel, and we had, of course, an enormous appreciation and admiration of the United States that has guided me throughout my life. But Israel was my country, and when the time came to join the Army and defend the country, I did so not only without reservations, but with great enthusiasm, as did my other two brothers.
No matter how much you learn from your parents, one of the things that's glaring in this book is if your military career was almost finished in school, manhood, leadership, crisis, how to having to see death firsthand and navigating, seeing what people are made of. You tell it in such a riveting way in this book about your military experience.
Well, no question. It was a formative, these were formative years, 5 years between the ages of 18 and 23. I joined a special unit, I suppose a combination of what you would call Navy SEALs and Delta Force, much smaller, very tight, very select group, and it was hard to get into it, but I could tell you it was much harder staying in it because the training was grueling, the missions were daunting. I nearly died several times in a firefight in the middle of the Suez Canal during the war of attrition we had at the time with Egypt, in storming a hijacked airplane in Tel Aviv airport. And many other opportunities which I escaped death. So first of all, I was glad to be alive. More importantly, I made sure all of my soldiers came out alive. We performed all our missions, most of them clandestine, beyond, sometimes deep beyond enemy lines. And I can tell a lot of it. Of course, there are some things I can't talk about, but I talk quite a bit about it. And yes, I find that readers are intrigued by it because they get a firsthand view of what Israel's special units are like, and they're alike and yet unlike any others in the world. And it's a story. There's a lot of adventure there, and a lot of brushes with near death.
The Honorable Benjamin Netanyahu, in his book, My Story, you know, there's so much that he talks about in his book about his relationships with the American presidents that were in office during his service to his beloved Israel. But one of the things that are fascinating, and I'm bringing the book back home to the United States now, where he talked about in 1996, where former President Bill Clinton talked about how they did everything in their power to make sure he was defeated. And you talked about also about how many, so often in your career, people who have schemed against you to undermine you. And also the disrespect from former President Barack Obama when you talk about Iran and you talk about their naivety about foreign policy and about being in Afghanistan. Talk about that aspect of the book where you talk about American presidents, you talk about foreign policy, and you talk about the decisions that were made that came back to be very costly.
Well, I think that you have to understand that Israel and the United States are like a family, and in a family you have common bonds, deep bonds, which are actually unbreakable through successive administrations, Republican and Democrats alike. But as in a family, you can also have differences of opinion. And I certainly had differences of opinion with President Clinton, President Obama, sometimes even with President Trump, I have to say. And these were based on our assessment of what is the true situation in the Middle East. And we saw the true problem in the Middle East is, first of all, vis-a-vis the Palestinians, as their persistent refusal to accept a Jewish state in any boundary. And they saw that problem rooted in what they thought are settlements, which is really, in other words of saying, Jews living in their ancestral homeland, in the land of the Bible, which has been our homeland for over 3,000 years. And of course, the Palestinians said you should live in any place, not only in Judea and Samaria, you shouldn't be in Tel Aviv, shouldn't be in Jerusalem, you shouldn't be in Haifa. They basically wanted us out. They mistakenly told the world that we're like the Belgians in the Congo, foreign people taking over a strange land and doing all these horrible things to the natives. We're not doing horrible things to the natives. We're not doing anything except offering peace and coexistence and prosperity. But it is they who drove us out of our land. It is they who want us to drive us in the sea. So we had this difference with both Presidents Clinton and Obama. But I said something else. I said, look, we can get peace with the broader Arab world. The Palestinians are basically 1% to 2% of the Arab world. We can get peace with the rest of the Arab world. And they said, no, first you have to go through the Palestinians. And that, they didn't agree with that. They didn't agree with that. They said, no, you have to go through Ramallah. And those people didn't want peace with Israel. They wanted a peace without Israel, the Palestinians. They want not a state next to Israel, but a state instead of Israel. They call us the colonials, but we are actually the original natives of the land. We're the owners of the land. We've been there for thousands of years. It is they who kicked us out, and we came back to live. We're not kicking out anyone. They can live with us. Anyway, we couldn't agree on that. So it took me a long time to go around this Palestinian veto, get to the Gulf states, and we made, once it worked a lot in a lot of clandestine meetings that I had to do and to make, and I did that with, finally with the help of President Trump. But the meetings began well before, secret meetings, it started well before his term in office. And we achieved the historic Abraham Accords. In other words, contrary to what all the foreign policy experts in Washington were saying, in contrast to what two U.S. presidents were saying, we did make peace. We started to expand peace. We made 4 historic peace agreements with Morocco, with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates, and with the Sudan, without going through the Palestinians, because if it's up to them, we'd never make peace. And indeed, for a quarter of a century, we didn't, because we were stuck in this Palestinian groove. We got out of the groove. And now we're in a position to continue, as I intend to do when I'm sworn in as Prime Minister within a week or so, to pursue an even broader peace with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab world, those who are not beholden to this Palestinian straitjacket. And I think this is great. It's not only great for us, great for the Arab world, and it's great also ultimately for the Palestinians, who are controlled by this rejectionist leadership for close to a century, who basically want to wipe us away. And I think that's one issue of disagreement. The other one was Iran. I thought Iran is the most dangerous force in the Middle East, one of the most dangerous countries in the world. It shouldn't be allowed to have a path to nuclear weapons, which is what the failed agreement with Iran, nuclear agreement, would do. So I had these disagreements with them. But, it's disagreements, as I said, Armstrong, within the family. And I never lose sight of the fact that the U.S., under any administration, is our indispensable ally.
One of the things you pointed out in the book, which fascinated, in about 2 minutes before we go to a break here, is John Kerry and the training of the soldiers in Afghanistan, and how you said once it collapsed, they will become your enemy. But if you look at America and you look at Afghanistan, you really lay out from your experience the stability you've given your country over the last couple of decades, how important it is to learn from the past and never realize that your enemies really don't change.
Well, you know, when you're faced with radical Islamists who are committed to the destruction of Israel, they call us, as Iran does, the small Satan. They call the U.S. the great Satan. They chant death to Israel, death to America, and death to all the infidels in between. And that includes most of the Arabs, because they're not radical Iranian Shiites. That's a regime you're not going to placate. It's a regime you're not going to pacify. It's a regime that you have to oppose strongly, and you have to realize that any territory that you vacate in the Middle East will be taken over by Iran's proxies. Yes, I had a disagreement with John Kerry about that. He said we could move away from Judea Samaria. We could let the Palestinian Authority, America will train them, and once we depart, they'll be fine. They'll be able to handle the Islamists. And I said, no, I don't think so. I don't think that'll happen, because we did that. We tried that in Gaza. We left, and as soon as we left, Hamas, an Iranian proxy, took over with the backing of Iran. When we left Lebanon, Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, took over with the backing of Iran as well. And I said that's what will happen again if we left Judea Samaria, the West Bank, as it's called, in the West. Well, he didn't agree with me, and he suggested to me, I recount this in the book, among many.
Hold that point, because I want you to recount this without being interrupted. My story, right. The Prime Minister-elect from Israel, the Honorable Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. Mr. Prime Minister, continue that story.
Well, when I said this to Secretary of State John Kerry, he said to me, look, I want to prove to you that we, the United States, can train local forces and they'll be able to hold up to the Islamists. And he suggested that he arranged for me a clandestine visit to Afghanistan, where I could see the great work done by the U.S. training the local forces to resist the Taliban once the United States leaves. And I said to him, John, I respect you, but I fully disagree with you. I'm telling you that literally minutes after you leave, those local forces that you trained will be wiped away by the Taliban, and they'll take over. And of course, we can see now in retrospect who was right and who was wrong. And it's the same thing with the argument that we could never have peace with Arab states unless we go through the Palestinians first, who veto any such peace. In fact, John Kerry said, and I quote this in the book too, he said, no, it's not going to happen. Well, it did happen. Actually, it happened 4 times already, and it'll happen many more times in the coming years, I believe, if the Arab leaders, I think, will respond to my overtures, and I think they will. So I think that there has been a difference of views between American presidents and Israelis, and that's natural. We can't see eye to eye on everything. We're here, you're there. But I think what great things happen when an American president and an Israeli prime minister see eye to eye, great things happen. And that happened in the last part of the Trump administration when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, long overdue, given that King David declared it as our capital 3 millennia ago, okay? When he recognized our sovereignty in the Golan Heights, when he walked away from the horrible nuclear deal, and especially when he joined me in completing the Abraham Accords. And I think more things can follow. These are good things for Israel, good things for our Arab neighbors, and good things for America, because we all stand together against Iran, which threatens all of us. And God forbid, should this radical Islamic regime that chants death to America get possession of nuclear weapons, and also have a path paved with gold to a nuclear arsenal with hundreds of billions of dollars of tax relief. I'm glad to see that this is at least momentarily off the table, but I can assure you that this occupied a good part. Preventing Iran from having nuclear weapons occupied a good part of my time in office, and will occupy a good part of my time returning to office.
You talked about in your book your most recent defeat, and of course, the people recognize your leadership by empowering you again. You talk about Bennett's Muslim Brotherhood and Naftali Bennett. Talk about that aspect of your book and the significance, and also help our American audience understand what is it that's so misunderstood about you. Because I'm sure in writing a book, Mr. Prime Minister, there are things you learn about yourself. When you go over, you say, wow, talk about those things, about the person they may not know. They talk about the fact that in your book, you don't talk about the indictments, you don't talk about the corruption. But if you read the book in your own way, you do talk about it.
Yeah, I do talk about it, but I'm still in a legal process. Interestingly, look, I was brought to trial on fake charges, trumped-up charges, and anybody would say that, right? But given the things that were revealed in my trial, you see horrible things. You see the blackmailing of witnesses. You see the use of the most advanced spyware on the planet against people around me in order to essentially to blackmail them. And all of that was revealed. So, these charges are crumbling in court in the last year. And that's the interesting thing. We had elections. I lost the elections. And then I went to trial. And then in this year, the government fell. The government that deposed me fell. And I was brought back to office again. Unheard of, really. I think it's not happened in very few times that people can come back twice from political defeat. Leaders usually don't do that. But I was brought back for several reasons. One, the voters could now compare what's life like in Israel and what the leadership was like when I was there for 15 years and when somebody replaced me. Okay, everybody said, you can't see it unless you actually see it. So now they could see it. The other thing, though, is that interestingly enough, even though in previous election campaigns, the charges of corruption were raised as the reason why I shouldn't stay in office and shouldn't return to office, in this year, in this campaign, it wasn't mentioned. I don't think it was mentioned even once in the opponents, in my rival's campaign, for the simple reason that it collapsed in court and people could see it. So I came back with a renewed affirmation of my leadership and my policies from the people of Israel. And I'm very grateful to them. And I'm very grateful to the millions of supporters outside Israel who share the belief of the majority of Israelis that we should lead Israel in the direction that I've led it now for the last decade and a half.
Your father was a visionary historian. This is according to you. And in many ways, you're a visionary in your own right. In the book, you talk about this, but help us unpack the impact your father had on your vision, had given you the strength to survive any and every circumstance. It's as if your life was prepared for you at the feet of your father, and now you as if you're the father of Israel.
Well, I'll tell you this. My father had an enormous impact on me. He was a great historian, a man of unbelievable intellectual and moral clarity. And he taught me that in the field of nations, in the field of history, the strong survive and the weak don't. And you can be the most moral country, the most moral people in the world, but if you are unable to defend yourself against the forces of evil, they devour you. That's what happened to the Jewish people over centuries. We were kicked out of our homeland. We were dispersed among the nations. We were exiled, pogrom, murdered, and finally massacred in the greatest crime in the history of humanity, the Holocaust. And so we somehow managed to retain or restore our sovereignty in our ancient homeland, the land of Israel, build a country, build an army. And now we have the capacity to defend ourselves. And so my father's generation was tasked with restoring the state of Israel. My generation was tasked with assuring its continuity, assuring its permanence. And how do you do that? Well, the only way you can do that is by assuring its strength. And what is the first element of strength? It's very clear, especially when you're faced with neighbors like Iran. You have to have military strength. But military strength costs a lot of money. So in order to have a strong military, you need a strong economy. A strong economy we did not have because we were built on socialist lines. One of the things I describe in my book is the great revolution of turning semi-socialist Israel into a free market, robust, innovative economy. So we did that too. And all of that derives from my father's insight that the key to survival is strength, military, economic, diplomatic strength. Of course, the inner strength, the inner fiber of the people comes before all that. But I've basically devoted my life and my premierships to build Israel's strength. And that strength also brought us peace. Because when you're weak, nobody makes peace with you. They make peace with the strong. And in our area, which is still not surrounded by democracies, it's not only to get the peace that you need to be strong, it's to keep the peace you need to be strong. Because people always look around and see, who's our peace partner? Are they strong? Are they resolute? Can we trust them? And if they're not, and if Israel is not strong, it will not only not make peace, it won't keep the peace. I insist on making Israel strong, and I'll insist on making it even stronger in the coming years. That's good for Israel, it's good for peace.
You know, it's interesting, in your book, you talk about, you've known Biden a long time, and you talked about in a conversation with him, he talked about the Democratic Party shift on Israel. What did that mean to you? And do you get the cooperation from the Biden administration? Of course, you're being a global diplomat. I know you're going to answer that very carefully.
No, I'll answer it truthfully. First of all, Joe Biden has been my friend for 40 years, ever since he was a young senator from Delaware, and I was a young diplomat, Israeli diplomat in Washington. And we've disagreed over the years. He always says, Bibi, I love you. I don't agree with anything you say. And I say, Joe, it's mutual. It's not actually. Both of us agree sometimes and quite a few times with each other. But yeah, we disagreed on Iran. I think that disagreement is less pronounced today, given that Iran's true nature has been unmasked for all the world to see. It's brutal oppression of the men and women who are brave, so brave and standing up to that regime. So I think a nuclear deal is not in the offing. And we agree on many other things. But, I would say that there's a myopia here about the fringe groups, especially in the Democratic Party. They don't really speak for the majority of Americans. Most Americans Republicans, Democrats, Independents support Israel. They instinctively see Israel as the front line of democracies in the Middle East. And in many ways, the radical Muslims see it that way too. They say, you are the small Satan, they're the great Satan, because you are them, that's the United States, and they are you. And in many ways, our free, open societies are anathema to them, and we do stand together against. So most of them support Israel. And by the way, people don't know that. It's true that there's been a surge in Republican support for Israel in the last decade, but Democratic support, despite the radical fringe, has stayed pretty stable. And these are great numbers when you look at it compared to other countries. Israel is one of the countries most supported by the American public, and they're right. I'll tell you why. Because America has no better ally than Israel, and Israel certainly has no better ally than the United States. And we both stand for the ideas of freedom. We're the original promised land, and we ingathered our exiles, as the biblical prophecy said, built a free, democratic, prosperous state. And you're the new promised land. And I would say both of our countries are built on an idea. That's the main thing. We were created with a purpose. Ours to resurrect the Jewish people, and yours to be the guardian of liberty in the world. And as long as we remember our the most basic purposes of the foundation of our countries, we'll be all right, and our alliance will be terrific.
As I say goodbye to you and thank you for always honoring us. I remember decades ago, I was in your office in the Knesset in Jerusalem for a sit-down with you. And one of the things about reading your book, My Story, I've watched how you've aged over the years, how you've matured, you become more calm. And, everybody is talking about the fact that you're naming your cabinet, and they want to say it's controversial because if you don't name someone LGBTQ, you're controversial. But those may be the values of Americans, but it's not necessarily the values of the Middle East. And it doesn't mean you malign, you're against someone. You just have to do what is in the best interest of your country and to keep your party together, because you're still building a coalition government. So I would like for you to talk about, as part of your story, but also aging, growing older, growing wiser, and realizing what really is important, especially in this fact that you've got another chance as the Prime Minister of the country that you've dedicated your life to.
Well, I think in some cases, our basic character is formed in early years, but as you mature, you gain wisdom, insight, and experience, and you're less erratic. You're less taken off course by events, because you understand what is important and what is not. You separate the wheat from the chaff, and that helps a lot. Wisdom and experience are very important in leadership, but they don't substitute, obviously, for bold action when you need to take it, or to be circumspect when you don't. And the best way you can get to make those decisions is by, going through the trials and through the tribulations of leadership. So I've been fortunate to have been reelected time and again by the Israeli people, who think that, to use your words, as I mature, I apparently do not get worse. What do the decades give you? They give you perspective on yourself. They give you perspective on the historic times we're in and the role that you should be playing. More importantly, they give you, I think, a perspective on what is crucial and what is not. And the most important thing for me is to assure the survival, future, prosperity, and security of the state of Israel. I think I have two great tasks. One is to block Iran's, as best as I can, from having nuclear weapons, which will threaten the entire world. And the second is to expand the peace, to complete the circle of peace around us. And the third, by the way, is to continue the free market technological revolution that has made Israel a light unto the nations, and will improve the life of all the nations. Now, I think one of the things is I have, as the years pass, I have less to prove, but nonetheless, I live by these principles, and people can see that. They can see, they know very well. If a politician, a political leader is out for himself, they know it. They don't buy all the politicians speak of the common good and their purpose, and many of them believe it. But I'll tell you, the public has a clear sense. They understand if you're guided by a mission, if you're guided out only by looking out for yourself. And it doesn't make a difference what your political detractors say about you, because they'll always say that you're out for yourself. The public knows. They have a very good sense of it. And I'm happy to say that they think that of me continuously, certainly in this last election, and I intend to prove them right.
I want to thank you so much for my story. It was a great read, a lot of surprises, much respect, and we wish you well. And we certainly celebrate the fact that Israel has and always will be our greatest ally. Thank you so much for joining us. I wish you well, not only in the success of your book, but in the treacherous road that lies ahead for you. But you've been seasoned enough and become wise enough to handle it. And we have no doubt that Israel will continue to prosper and benefit under your leadership.
Thank you, Armstrong. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to plug my book, which I just did unabashedly. Read my book. I think you'll find it of interest.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm Armstrong Williams. Thank you so much for joining us. When we come back, we'll be joined by C. Derek Campbell to talk about African mines and minerals on this special edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. And welcome back to the broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us. C. Derek Campbell is joining us now. He's the executive chairman of the African Metals Group. Explain to our global audience the African Metals Group.
Okay, absolutely. Armstrong, thank you for having me and giving me a chance to talk about African Metals Group, but also talk about opportunities in Africa in the natural resources space. So African Metals Group is really a mining and investment company. We are what's called a royalty and streaming company, and what we do is focus on helping African mining and metals operations, companies that are trying to operate and grow. Well, we provide them the financing to expand their operations, and then ultimately help them supply the things that the world needs in these critical supply chains like gold and silver for industrial use, and also copper, manganese, class 1 nickel, all those things that support energy transition in the battery metals market.
You know, how do you provide innovative financing and equity investment opportunities?
Yeah, so through a couple of ways. Specific to African metals, what we do is we will go in and do what's called either a royalty or a streaming deal, where we'll take some royalty on the dividends, or we'll stream the actual production, where we will go into a long-term agreement with them at a discount, and we will take the production. So what that does is that lets us as a company eliminate a lot of the risk that happens on the CapEx, OpEx side for operating companies who operate in multiple jurisdictions throughout the continent. And we take that production and we off-sell it and share some of the discount with the buyers. But what does that do for the operator? It lets them have upfront cash, which is difficult for them to get from institutions.
Now, when you think about the minerals, the metals, the mines, you think about the American businessman, you think about the global businessman. We talk about Africa as if it's one place,
right?
But it's a place of many sovereigns.
That's right.
I mean, it is a continent.
That's correct.
But there are people who are looking to do business. There are metals, there are materials that they look for, and sometimes they think they can only find them in Europe, in the United States. Why is it that more of our American entrepreneurs and businesses realize they need to go to the different continents of Africa, to these different sovereign places, and cast down their buckets there, because there's so many opportunities?
Yeah, there's so many opportunities there. And you and I talked about this a little bit before when we met. Africa has 54 different countries in it, and each of those countries has been well endowed with natural resources, from hydrocarbon natural resources, oil and gas, opportunities, water, timber, and yes, metals and critical minerals, strategic metals and critical minerals. The American businessman, unfortunately, has a bad narrative about Africa, and that narrative is one of famine, AIDS, and war throughout the continent. But when you get on ground, you actually see something else. There are businessmen, business owners, there are regulatory environments that are very pro-business. And I think at the government level, the United States has tried, but it hasn't done such a good job about changing that narrative. I think there is too much of a aid narrative and a, hey, let's help the African narrative, when the Africans are saying, we don't need aid, we don't need help, we need partnerships. And it's a very ripe environment for some producer of some technology, some investor in the United States, some U.S. Operator themselves. The time is right now for them to go into the continent and then find partners who, one, they can get recourse against, two, operate in regulatory environments where they can recuperate their cash, and three, give them an additional offtake scenario for the U.S. product or service that this U.S. companies represent to now grow in an environment that needs absolutely everything.
What about the rule of law and the contracting?
Sure.
You know, some people still see some of these 54 countries as still the Wild Wild West.
Right.
You got to make sure that if there is a contract dispute, that you know you're going to be treated fairly.
That's right.
There are just a lot of issues that people are concerned with when it comes to making sure there's a judicial system in place.
That's right.
And there's a respect for the contract and the agreement.
That's right. That's right. Well, I would say to you that there is a challenge in Africa in this sphere for American businesses that try to deal with potentially 54 different types of regulatory environments. But I will tell you that in most of the countries, the rule of law is something that they have to put in place just to operate for themselves internally. And there are law firms like Templar's Law out of Nigeria, Centurion Law out of Johannesburg that they have reached throughout the continent that will help you get recourse to folks who are, you know, indigenous people who are operating on the continent. And one of the issues or opportunities is a lot of these indigenous people who are reaching out globally for partners, they have to be licensed in order to do that. And so both from a judicial system framework and construct, and then also from, let's say, a Ministry of Industry, a Ministry of Energy, a Ministry of Mining perspective, if we stay focused in this energy, natural resource infrastructure space, those ministries want to make sure that whoever is representing their country commercially, that there are no shenanigans taking place. And so there have no doubt been issues and problems with folks trying to get recourse against maybe an investment they've made or some deal that they have done. but we see a definite wane in that, and we see an uptick in successful U.S. interaction on the continent in multiple countries.
Is there a blueprint you should follow before even starting this process?
Yeah, I think I'd say there are a couple of blueprints. One is, I know that the U.S. Commerce Department, they have what's called the Gold Key program, and there are commercial attaches throughout the continent, and they go in and physically audit is a loose term, but I'll use it for the purposes of this discussion. They'll audit these local companies so that they will then say, hey, we have audited this company, so U.S. company X, Y, or Z. There is an ABC company in African country X, Y, or Z that you can now work with because we've audited them. Also, too, reaching out to some of these law firms that I've mentioned, like Centurion or Templars or others, who, no kidding, I would say, have partnerships with these companies who can kind of give you a little bit of a buffer in terms of making sure that there is an audit trail, there's an audit-ready partner on the other side of the Atlantic who U.S. businesses can partner with.
Our guest on this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show is C. Derek Campbell, who is the executive chairman of the African Metals Group. The company is based out of London.
Yeah, we're a London-based company. Yeah, absolutely, we are.
We're going to take a break, and we'll come back. Don't go away.
Okay.
You know, there's so much talk about the Chinese dominance in these 54 countries. Mm-hmm. Is that a result of America and our government dropping the ball?
To some degree it is, and I'll talk about it from a couple of perspectives. You know, as Americans, and even some of our partners like the Brits, we have to be honest about some of the approaches that we've taken. And so if you look at the instruments of national power that the United States has, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic, we're okay in the D, the I, and the M, but in the E, we're really small in terms of federal dollars being poured into the continent in specific areas to help things like industry grow, to help things like healthcare, to help things like the proper exploitation of natural resources. And then from a, I'd say, bilateral perspective, the U.S. sometimes creates regimes or engagements that don't necessarily benefit the Africans. And so now Africans have to look for other partners, because throughout the continent you'll see countries growing, populations needing jobs, and opportunities that need to be properly exploited that don't get exploited. And I think the Chinese and the Russians are taking advantage of that. One of the things that people hear me say is that I find it very strange that the U.S. is battling for a hegemonic pole position in Africa, where Africans clearly want to have us as their partner of choice. And we are battling for that hegemonic pole position against the Russians and the Chinese. And what makes it even more strange to me is that 50 million of the citizens of the United States, or almost 50 million, genetically hail from the continent of Africa. And it's absurd to me that you can barely put 500,000 Afro-Chinese or Afro-Russians into a stadium, right? And so why are we not taking advantage of what some would say a natural kind of engagement that we could have in the continent to create better opportunities for U.S. companies to go in and take advantage of the demand signal, which is, in the case of what we do at African Metals, it's about the proper support and exploitation of natural resources that benefit really not just the America, that don't just benefit the Africans, but benefit the world, particularly in this time of global energy transition.
What is it that Africa must do? Mm-hmm. You know, you need the right infrastructure to attract businesses. You need to feel safe.
That's right.
And secure. You know, what is often underreported is still there's a lot of bloody conflict that's going on across the continent. It's very real, whether it's Sierra Leone, whether it's the Republic Congo, it exists. And so what is it that it needs to do where government really work for the people, and particularly when they are sent these astronomical dollars in aid that is not looted and go for the benefit of your wallet and never gets to the people that are in dire straits? Because, you know, there is still a lot of abject poverty.
Yeah, there is.
There is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would tell you, you know, in Sierra Leone and in the Republic of Congo, that's Congo-Brazzaville, there has been a massive amount of reduction of conflict, and safety is great, and regimes are in place to help, particularly in the energy and natural resource space, have good business happen. In Democratic Republic of Congo, there are still some challenges that folks have to deal with. I'm the former Marine and Naval Attaché to Nigeria. I was the former Chief of Military Plans for the United Nations mission in South Sudan. So I've seen some of this security issues and geopolitical issues that you're talking about very firsthand. As a person with a company that doesn't try to engage Washington from London or Washington, engage Africa from London or Washington, we're on the continent. Some of the things you talk about we do see, but there are also things that are not reported that we do see, which is rule of law in place, great infrastructure being developed, good police force reform, great banking reform, so that you can have the expatriation of your capital, your cash, to your vendors and to your international partners. And so I think a lot of that good stuff is not being talked about, and there needs to be really not just on a country-by-country basis, but I think there needs to be, maybe the African Union does this, but there's got to be a better narrative campaign done at a strategic level, so that folks don't sit on the sidelines, particularly folks in the West, sit on the sidelines about Africa, where they can say, hey, I've got enough information, I'm now very confident about going in and selecting a partner that could help me grow my business, grow my platform across multiple verticals on the continent. And I think that is a narrative discussion that is media focused, that is strategic communication focused, and until we get that to happen, you're not going to know about the good things happening on the continent, and why the risk that you think you will undergo there is not as difficult as you think it is.
You know, I heard our President Biden say towards the end of 2022 that he thinks it's important that these African countries, some of them, become the part of the G20.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I had already seen indications of that earlier before the president made that announcement. But why has it taken so long?
Yeah, again, the narrative, right? It's the historical narrative on Africa, and you look at the G20 and the influence or the influential partners in the G20, those European nations in the G20, a lot of whom have had imperialistic positioning on the continent of Africa. And then there's been an aid-based, I don't want to say just discussion, but an aid-based interaction between Africans and Europe and other parts of the West. And so there's been this kind of feeling that, well, they don't really rate to be a part of the G20. Well, now African nations know that all of the natural resources that have helped these G20 nations kind of become powerhouses have come out of Africa, and now they're taking the rightful position and stance that, wait a minute, we own these natural resources. We now need to use them for the development of our own societies. And because we're the owners of these natural resources that are going to drive things like global energy transition, we now need to have a seat at the table.
What is the multi-commodity approach, and what is its importance?
Okay, the multi-commodity approach, and I'll say it a little bit better. It's a little different, rather. It's there is a multi-critical mineral strategic metal approach that is now driving this thing called energy transition. You've heard this whole discussion about battery metals. You've heard about the EV market. You've heard folks talk about now the nuclear energy, small-scale modular reactor market, the semiconductor market, and how things in semiconductors are now changing. The baseline materials that drive all of that are these multiple commodities that exist, not just in Africa, but across the world. You're talking about cobalt, class 1 nickel, manganese, lithium, even uranium.
Do you think people understand the value of these precious metals and their meaning?
Yeah, I don't think so. Well, at scale, I don't think so. One of the things I think Forbes put out an article about 2 or 3 weeks ago saying there is a boom demand in critical minerals and strategic metals. There's a boom demand in things that support the nuclear energy industry. But for whatever reason, the capital markets are kind of sitting perched on the sidelines, not fully investing in these things that have shown in the market a clear demand for. There's a clear demand signal for more and more of these materials to be put into the market. In fact, there was an executive order put out by the Biden administration, Executive Order 14017, that clearly delineates 6 of these major critical minerals to help support the supply chain gaps that exist, not just in the U.S., but really for the West, these OECD countries. Things like cobalt, class 1 nickel, manganese, copper, things like that. And so when it comes to pricing for these commodities, you see an interesting thing happening. We'll take gold, for instance. When people see gold, they're like, hey, even though there's inflation and you want to get as much gold as possible to hedge against inflation, what you see gold do when you look at it in a short-term lens is you see gold do like this. But in actuality, if you look at gold the way you're supposed to look at gold, which is long-term, 5, 10, 15 years, gold does do like this, like a sine wave, but it goes up the whole time. And that happens with silver. That is happening now with cobalt, uranium. You're seeing spikes in a lot of these commodities. And I think from an investment standpoint, these are safe and smart to go after. But I think the investment discussion and the demand signal discussion, that nexus hasn't been fully, the nexus hasn't happened, and the driving to the nexus hasn't happened. And also the narratives that support this kind of nexus of good things that happen when you put the commodity to the demand signal, the narrative hasn't been the greatest.
For entrepreneurs and thought leaders and other officials watching this broadcast, what is it that you'd like for them to take away from your message?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is specific to Africa. Africa is open for business. It is. I'm a guy who has been in Africa as an entrepreneur, as a military officer, and I've just seen the continent grow in leaps and bounds in my 20-plus years of, almost 20 years of operating on the continent. So one is Africa's open for business. 2 is the global energy transition is real. And renewables will not support the demand signal the baseload demand signal to create industries across the world, particularly in the continent of Africa. And the narratives need to be that since global energy transition is real, we need to have a broad look, what they call a look at the energy basket mix, and include everything in it. Not just renewables, but yes, oil and gas, and also strategic metals, critical minerals, and rare earth elements, because they're essential to the growth of industry across the world to help us get to a full energy basket mix use to support energy transition.
Is there a website?
Yes, for African Metals there is. Go to africanmetalsgroup.com, and there you'll find out about what we do is mining and mineral finance and investment guys in support of this global energy transition.
Well, you know, I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us for this inaugural 2023 edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. We started out with the head of state, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and also the executive chairman of the African Metals Group, C. Derek Campbell. I hope people learn more about the metals industry. I want people to hear more about the Prime Minister's story and the kind of challenges that people of his stature face, the longest serving Prime Minister in the history of Israel. And thank you all so much for joining us. And these are the kind of shows and the kind of discussions we will continue to have throughout 2023. Thank you, WJLA 24/7, Howard Stark Holdings. I'm Armstrong Williams. And yes, happy 2023.